This video is called The Battle at Little Bighorn, and it's an example of how Native Americans fought back against poor treatment. Before we begin, let's recap a little bit. We already learned some examples of how Native Americans were mistreated by the United States. This particular example is happening in the late 1800s. So by the mid to late 1800s, Native Americans really had no reason to trust the United States. You already saw that in the Trail of Tears. There were repeated promises and things that were made by the United States, and they broke a lot of those promises. So by the 1870s or so, Native Americans have basically stopped listening. Since the 1600s, the first Europeans and the later Americans have consistently lied, broke treaties, and mistreated Native Americans, which is pretty obvious. The remaining tribes that were left in the West were really unwilling to make deals, and some were willing to fight to the end. And the Sioux tribe that we're going to be learning about in this particular video is one of those tribes. One of the main reasons that the Battle at Little Bighorn happened is because of United States expansion. It's really, expansion and greed. Buffalo in the West is, or used to be at least, a species that was everywhere. You can see from the picture here, this is a photograph of a herd of buffalo. They would be all across the Great Plains. And buffalo hides become very valuable, so buffalo hunters, United States citizens, go out west and they can use guns to kill buffaloes very easily. They skin the buffaloes, sell the hides for money. This causes the buffalo population to decrease rapidly. It was in the millions before the United States started hunting buffalo, and they at one point get it down to like 60 buffalo total left in the world. So they almost make them extinct. The Native Americans used buffalo, their hides, their meat, and lots of different parts of the buffalo for their lifestyle. So without buffalo, Native Americans struggle to survive, and hunger is prevalent. So there really is no food for Native Americans to eat. Their traditional hunting lifestyle is over because of the buffalo, which causes Native American chiefs to have to move on to United States reservations and then become basically dependent on the United States government for food. Once reliant on the United States for survival, basically you already learned the United States doesn't treat Native Americans very well. So Indians that have to go onto reservations by choice because they can't support their families and their tribes basically live a life of poverty and of a life of hunger and poverty because the United States government doesn't provide for them the way they promised to. So that brings us to a person named Sitting Bull. He is a chief of the Lakota Sioux, and he is going to be one of the most famous and successful resistance fighters for Native Americans. He's raised a warrior, he's a fierce fighter and a leader, and despite the tough times and the lack of buffalo, he refuses to move onto a reservation. He unites the Plains tribes Indians, including the Cheyenne, the Sioux, and other tribes, together to resist moving onto reservations and to fight back against the United States government. So that brings us to the Great Sioux War. In 1876, the U.S. needs the lands where the Lakota Sioux live, big part of the Great Plains, for gold mining and to build railroads. And they order all Native Americans onto reservations. Many Native Americans, as I've already said, have voluntarily moved on the reservations because of a lack of food. But some Native American tribes, including the Lakota Sioux and Sitting Bull, have refused to accept that fate for themselves. So in 1876, they're all told to move on to reservations. But the Lakota Sioux and other bands of Plains tribes, led by Sitting Bull, resist and they fight back. And this period of time is known as the Great Sioux War. The war only lasts a couple of years, and it's really more of a series of skirmishes between the Native Americans and the United States Army. But it's a pretty bloody skirmishes for that period of time. The most famous of all of those skirmishes was called the Battle at Little Bighorn. It's also named Custer's Last Stand. Basically, Sitting Bull takes all of the tribes that are resisting together and he puts them in a large camp near the Little Bighorn River. And this is going to be a place where all the tribes can kind of help each other out, they can combine their food, and they can continue to resist and refuse to move on to a reservation. General Custer is the head of the United States Army Cavalry, and he sees the camp, and he's following his orders, and says, "Oh, we're supposed to get these Indians to move on to reservations." So he goes over to them and attacks them, not understanding how big little Bighorn camp was. So Custer underestimates his enemy, didn't know that Sitting Bull had so many warriors, and basically General Custer is annihilated. His entire cavalry unit, which was a very famous cavalry unit, is just obliterated by Sitting Bull's troops. Now, Sitting Bull didn't even fight in the battle, but his troops, there were so many of them there that the United States Army's cavalry unit is completely wiped off the map. Custer himself was even killed, and it was a very, very embarrassing defeat for the United States and a great victory for the Sioux tribe and the Native Americans who were still trying to resist being forced onto a reservation. This marks probably the greatest victory that Native Americans ever had against the United States. Unfortunately, however, it wasn't enough. It was one victory, and it was a great victory for Sitting Bull and the Lakota Sioux. But after Custer's defeat, the U.S., well, they send more military after them. And Sitting Bull and the other tribes are forced to flee into Canada to continue resisting, and they basically will refuse to move on to a reservation. But up in Canada, they run into a lot of the same problems. There's no food, it's cold, and after trying to hold out as long as they possibly can, they're eventually forced to move back into the United States, and they surrender to the United States. Sitting Bull is then put on a reservation, and actually, sadly, at the end of his life, he becomes an attraction at a Wild West show. So not only is he made to move onto a reservation, he's basically humiliated by becoming an attraction for people to go pay and look at. Some Sioux, however, do continue to resist and do so for another 10 or so years. There's small little groups of Sioux that even after Sitting Bull's defeat don't give up, but they're eventually massacred at a battle called Wounded Knee in 1890, and that is the end of Plains Indians living freely on the plains. By 1890, all of the Plains Indians are moved onto reservations. So in conclusion, the Battle of Little Bighorn was one of the greatest victories for Native American resistance against the United States, and Sitting Bull and the Lakota Sioux are an example of how Native Americans tried to fight back and fight for treatment and preserve their own way of life. Unfortunately for the Sioux and for most Native American tribes, though they had various victories, the Sioux had the Battle of Little Bighorn, which was a great victory, but overall there was very little success for Native Americans fighting back against the United States government, and by the early 1900s, pretty much all the Native Americans are moved onto reservations, and there's very few Native American tribes that are living a traditional lifestyle. Once on reservations, Native Americans continued to be victims of mistreatment and racism, and they are discriminated against, and many still live in poverty to this day. If you go out west and look at Native American reservations, there's still a lot of poverty because of the treatment during the 1800s.